There are no warnings in the record, no buildup, no long war. One day, the cities were standing, and then they weren't. Ugarit, the wealthiest trading city on the Mediterranean coast, burned to the ground around 1185 BC and was never rebuilt. Not abandoned, not relocated, gone. The last letter ever sent from the city was a panic-stricken message to Cyprus begging for ships that never came. And it wasn't just Ugarit. Within roughly 50 years, the greatest civilizations the ancient world had ever produced collapsed one by one. The Hittite Empire, gone. The Mycenaean palace cities, gone. The Levantine trade ports, the Cypriot copper networks, the palace economies that had linked the entire eastern Mediterranean for centuries, all of it wiped out. Historians would spend the next 3,000 years trying to figure out what happened, and nearly every answer points back to one group, a group with no homeland we can name, no language we can read, no empire of their own, a group the Egyptians simply called the Sea Peoples. Who were they? Where did they come from? And how did they bring the entire Bronze Age crashing down? We're going to dig into that. But first, you need to understand what they destroyed. To understand what the Sea Peoples did, you have to understand what they walked into. The Eastern Mediterranean, around 1250 BC, wasn't just civilized, it was a system. Every part of it connected to every other part. Pull one thread and the whole thing shifts. At the center sat Egypt, gold on the map. Ramesses II had just signed one of the earliest peace treaties in recorded history with the Hittites, settling decades of brutal warfare. The two greatest empires of the age had agreed to stop destroying each other. For a few decades, it worked. The Hittites, blue, controlled the interior of Anatolia, modern Turkey, dominant land power of the Near East, ironworking pioneers, ruthless military organizers. To their west, the Mycenaean Greeks, green, ran palace economies across the Aegean, heavily centralized, deeply literate, keeping meticulous inventories of everything from olive oil to bronze swords to wool. And connecting all of it were the trading cities of the Levantine coast, red, Ugarit chief among them, a city that genuinely did not care where you were from. Egyptians, Hittites, Mycenaean Greeks, Cypriots, Mesopotamian merchants, all welcome. Scribes writing in multiple languages on clay tablets that survive to this day. Here's how tightly this world was wired together. Bronze, the defining technology of the age, requires copper and tin. They almost never occur naturally together. Copper came mostly from Cyprus, tin came mostly from Afghanistan. For a Mycenaean palace to keep its army armed, it needed supply chains stretching 2,000 miles across sea and land. One weapon, two continents, every link in that chain had to hold, which meant the whole system was one bad disruption away from collapse. And then the Sea Peoples arrived. Here's the maddening thing about the Sea Peoples. We know what they did: inscriptions, wall carvings, administrative tablets, a paper trail of destruction across the entire eastern Mediterranean. But we have almost nothing from them. No texts in their own hand, no origin myths, no king lists, no burial sites we can point to with certainty. Almost everything we know comes from their enemies, and enemies are not known for their impartiality. The most detailed accounts come from Ramesses III at Medinet Habu. He describes waves of invaders arriving by land and sea, destroying everything in their path. He names specific groups: the Pelesit, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshish. He calls them a confederation, different peoples moving together, and says their target was Egypt itself. We also have Hittite records, fragmentary, because the Hittite Empire itself was collapsing. Panicked letters asking for grain, mentioning enemy ships. And we have the Ugaritic tablets, last desperate messages from a city that knew it was about to die. One letter reads, "Ships of the enemy have been sighted at sea. 7 ships have come and done very evil things."
The reply from Cyprus asked for troops. The troops never came. But here's where the mystery sharpens. The Egyptian accounts were written as propaganda. Ramesses III needed to present himself as a god king who saved civilization. How much of what he wrote is literal history, and how much is royal theater? We can't fully separate them. And the group names themselves, Pelesit, Checker, Denyen, we can't tie most of them to any specific archaeological culture. They appear in the record, cause catastrophe, and dissolve back into the fog. The question that's tormented historians for 2 centuries isn't just who they were, it's whether there was a they at all, a coherent group with a shared identity, or whether the Sea Peoples is a label the Egyptians slapped on a much messier reality. Could a collection of displaced people really topple kingdoms? There are 4 theories. They all conflict. Let's go through them one by one. Theory 1. Refugees.
The first theory, and the one with the most academic support right now, is that the Sea Peoples weren't conquerors from some distant homeland. They were refugees from civilizations that were already collapsing right there in the Aegean. The Mycenaean palace economies were showing serious strain by the mid-1200s BC. Reduced trade, hoarding of metals, population decline. The palace at Pylos, we know from its own linear B tablets, was in full emergency mode before it fell. Watchers posted on the coast, bronze collected from temple vessels to make weapons, a palace preparing for an attack it couldn't stop. As Mycenaean society fractured, populations were set in motion. They moved by land and sea, taking their families, their animals, their wagons. Nowhere to go back to. They pushed east and south, raiding where they could, settling where they could. When the Egyptians encountered them, they were looking at waves of desperate people who had already lost their own world and were running out of road. Egyptian reliefs don't just show warriors, they show ox carts carrying women and children. That detail matters. Refugees don't leave their families behind. It fits a pattern that repeats itself throughout human history. When civilizations collapse, people don't disappear. They move, and they carry their crisis with them. Theory 2 takes us deeper. Not just a symptom of collapse, a feedback loop that fed it. Eric Klein, one of the leading scholars on this period, calls it systems collapse. No single cause, a cascade. Drought reduces harvests, reduced harvests create food shortages, shortages destabilize governments, unstable governments disrupt trade, disrupted trade cuts off access to copper and tin. Without metals, armies can't be maintained. Without armies, raiders can't be stopped. Raiders disrupt more trade, and so on, a death spiral until everything collapses together. In this model, the Sea Peoples weren't the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were one of several simultaneous pressures alongside drought, earthquakes, internal unrest, and the built-in fragility of an over-specialized system that together brought down a world. No single villain, just a system that had run out of room to absorb shocks and then absorbed too many at once. Messier than a simple invasion story, and honestly, more frightening. Theory 3, some of this looks like professional raiding, organized, tactical, selective. Sea-based raiding was already part of the late Bronze Age world before the collapse. Mercenaries from the Aegean, the Luca from western Anatolia, were raiding Egyptian coasts as early as the reign of Amenhotep III, decades before the main Sea Peoples wave. Some groups the Egyptians later classified as Sea Peoples appear earlier in Egyptian records as mercenaries serving in the Egyptian army itself. Think about what that means. Not strangers arriving from the edge of the world, people who had been inside the system for years. They knew where the wealth was concentrated. They knew where the defenses were thin. When the system started cracking, they were already positioned to take advantage. Less outside invasion, more inside job. The fourth theory is the one that reframes everything else. The Sea Peoples may never have been a real identity at all, just an Egyptian administrative label, a catch-all for a diverse mix of peoples, origins, and motivations that the Egyptians grouped together because from where they were standing, they all came from the sea and they were all a threat. The Peliset, possibly Aegean, potentially connected to the Mycenaeans. The Shekelesh, speculatively linked to Sicily. The Luca, almost certainly from western Anatolia. The Denyen, phonetically close to the Danaans, one of Homer's names for the Greeks. Different homelands, different reasons for moving, all caught in the same catastrophic moment, all pointing toward the same target, the last surviving wealthy civilization. What the Egyptians saw as one coordinated invasion may have been something more like a traffic jam, multiple displaced populations moving in the same direction at the same time for overlapping but distinct reasons, not an army, a convergence. Here's where we are. The Bronze Age world was tightly wired, 1250 BC at its peak. Starting around 1200 BC, something triggered a cascade of failures across the entire system. The Sea Peoples appeared right in the middle of it, some fleeing collapse, some exploiting it, some probably both. Every theory overlaps, every theory conflicts, and the attacks, when they came, hit harder than anyone predicted. The Hittite Empire was the first major casualty. By 1200 BC, the empire was already under pressure. Internal succession fights, conflict with Assyria to the east, growing threats on its western and southern borders. Then something delivered the final blow. The capital, Hattusa, was burned and abandoned. The Hittite king disappears from the record. The empire that fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh, that had dominated Anatolia for centuries, ceased to exist as a political entity almost overnight. The last Hittite records mention a desperate search for grain, a sign of famine. One letter to the king of Ugarit reads essentially, "I need grain immediately. It is a matter of life and death." The letter may never have been sent. It was found in a kiln at Ugarit, still being fired when the city was destroyed. A letter baked not by choice, but by the fire that killed the city. That single detail tells you everything about how fast this happened.
Ugarit was destroyed around 1185 BC. Archaeologists found a city frozen mid-breath, weapons stacked against walls, a bread oven still full of unbaked loaves, and in one house, jewelry buried carefully beneath the floor. Someone hid it, expecting to come back. Someone never did. The last tablets read like a slow-motion nightmare. The king of Ugarit writes to the king of Cyprus, "My cities were burned, and they did very evil things in my country. All my troops and chariots are in the Hittite country." He'd sent his military north to help the Hittites. His city was undefended. And then the ships came. The reply from Cyprus warns him to watch for enemy vessels. But the reply was still being processed in Ugarit's administrative system when the city burned. The correspondence ends mid-sentence. Ugarit wasn't alone. Up and down the coast and across Cyprus, the same story. Cities burned, some never reoccupied, all of it in the same 15-year window. New populations moved in after the original inhabitants were gone. Different pottery, different burial customs, different people. The copper trade that had fueled the Bronze Age for centuries, gone. Without copper, the bronze networks strained. Without bronze, palace economies couldn't function. The dominoes kept falling. Egypt holds, barely. Egypt survived. That is genuinely remarkable. Hit twice, under Mernetop around 1208 BC, then harder under Ramesses III around 1177 BC, and both times it held. Ramesses describes a coordinated assault, a land force pushing south through the Levant, while a naval force came by sea simultaneously. He blocked the land force at the Syrian border. For the naval fight, he positioned his fleet in a sheltered bay with archers stationed on shore. The Sea People's ships entered the bottleneck, unable to maneuver, under fire from every direction. It was a slaughter. But here's the thing. Egypt won and still collapsed, just more slowly. Ramesses III died in a court conspiracy shortly after his victories. The dynasty never recovered its former reach. The Levantine buffer zone was gone. Egypt turned inward and never again projected power the way it had. Victory, yes. Survival, barely. Let's stop here for a second. We've watched the Hittite Empire disappear. We've watched Ugarit burn. We've watched Egypt barely hold the line. And we've seen how every theory about why, refugees, feedback loops, professional raiders, a label that may never have described one real group, overlaps with every other theory without fully explaining it. Now comes the harder question. After all the destruction, who were these people really? Because some of them didn't vanish into history. Some of them built something. Because we can't read the Sea People's own writings, archaeologists did what archaeologists do. They followed the pottery. Along the southern Levantine coast, where Egypt settled some of the Sea Peoples as a garrison population after the battle with Ramesses, a new pottery starts appearing with unmistakable Aegean roots. Same shapes, same decorative motifs, same manufacturing techniques, but adapted, localized, changed over time. People connected to the Aegean world, quietly putting down roots in a new one. Archaeologists call this Philistine bichrome ware. The people who made it were almost certainly the Philistines, the Peliset from the Medinet Habu inscriptions. After the battle, surviving Peliset were settled by Egypt in Canaan. They built 5 cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. They developed a distinct culture, part Aegean, part Levantine, entirely their own. And they show up in later records, most famously in the Hebrew Bible. Excavations at Ekron, Ashkelon, and Ashdod reveal a sophisticated, productive society. Industrial-scale olive oil production, advanced ironworking, rich material culture. These weren't marauders who got lucky. They were people who had been displaced, found a new home, and built something lasting from the ruins. In 2019, scientists published ancient DNA analysis from burials at Ashkelon. The results were striking. People from the earliest Philistine occupation layer, the first generation after their arrival, carried significant ancestry from a southern European source population, consistent with the Aegean. That genetic signature wasn't present in the pre-Philistine Canaanite population at the same site. It appeared when the Philistines arrived, and within 2 or 3 generations, as newcomers married into local families, it was largely absorbed. Arrived post-collapse, integrated within a few generations. That 3-panel picture, arrival, blending, absorption, is as close to a smoking gun as Bronze Age archaeology gets. Real people from somewhere in the Aegean moving to the Levant at exactly the time the historical records say the Sea Peoples arrived. Not myth, not propaganda carved into a temple wall. Biology. The Denyen and the Greeks. The Denyen, another named group from Medinet Habu, may be even more intriguing. The name is phonetically close to the Danans, one of Homer's names for the Greeks in the Iliad. It may also connect to the tribe of Dan in the Hebrew Bible, and to a dynasty in southern Anatolia, whose people Phoenician inscriptions call the Danunians. None of those connections are certain, but if any of them hold, the Sea Peoples didn't just destroy the Bronze Age world. They may have seeded the Iron Age world that replaced it, becoming early Greeks, early Israelites, early Anatolian dynasties. The destroyers became the builders. The refugees became the founders. One of history's more uncomfortable ironies.
The Dark Age. The world that came after the Bronze Age collapse was radically different, and for several centuries it was worse. The first casualty was literacy. Linear B, the Mycenaean writing system, vanished completely. The Hittite script went with the empire. The Ugaritic alphabet, one of the earliest ever devised, was lost with the city that invented it.
For roughly 400 years, from about 1200 to 800 BC, the Greek world couldn't write. The stories of heroes, gods, and the Trojan War survived only as oral tradition, passed by memory from generation to generation until writing came back in the 8th century. 400 years of silence. When the Greeks re-emerge into history, they have no memory of Linear B. They borrowed a writing system from the Phoenicians and adapted it into the alphabet you're reading right now. The letters on this screen have a direct line back to the wreckage of the Bronze Age collapse. The trade network. One ship, 12 cultures, thousands of miles of supply chains, all depending on each other. After 1200 BC, that kind of cargo largely disappears from the archaeological record. Ships still sailed, shorter routes, more local, less connected. The long threads snapped, and with them, bronze. Iron wasn't better than bronze, not at first. Early iron weapons were often inferior to good bronze ones. But iron ore is everywhere. You don't need a two-continent supply chain to make an iron knife. You need a fire, a hammer, and ore from your own backyard. The Iron Age wasn't a technological leap forward. It was a civilization learning to live without the connections it had lost. The human cost. What would you do if your city burned and no help came? Archaeological surveys across Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and Cyprus all show the same answer playing out in the record. People left and didn't come back. Population estimates for the Aegean suggest a decline of 50 to 75% between 1200 and 1000 BC. Not just palace elites, everyone. Villages emptied, farmland went fallow. Those 4 dark centuries were a genuine civilizational regression. A world of palace economies became a world of subsistence farming. A literate, connected civilization became scattered communities trying to survive in the ruins of something they no longer fully understood. What survived? Not everything died. Egypt contracted but held. Assyria recovered and eventually dominated the ancient Near East. And in the wreckage of the Levantine coast, the Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, survived the worst of the collapse and slowly rebuilt the trade networks that had been destroyed. Smaller than Ugarit, less centralized, less brittle. When the Bronze Age trade system collapsed, the Phoenicians rebuilt a new one faster than anyone else because they weren't dependent on palace economies to fund it, just ships, skills, and coastal access. By 900 BC, they were ranging the entire Mediterranean, founding Carthage, sailing beyond Gibraltar. They carried the alphabet into every culture they touched. The Greeks learned to write from the Phoenicians, so did the Hebrews, the Arameans, and through them, most of the Western world. The survivors didn't just endure, they rebuilt. The Bronze Age collapse is one of the few examples we have of a complete, system-wide civilizational failure, not one empire falling, but an entire interconnected world going down together. And the causes, as best we can reconstruct them, are recognizable. Climate disruption, supply chains with no backup, systems so specialized that when one piece failed, everything downstream failed with it. Political instability feeding economic instability, feeding more political instability. Mass displacement driving conflict, conflict driving more displacement. A world that convinced itself it was too sophisticated, too connected, too permanent to collapse. And then, it collapsed.
Here's the thing about complex, tightly connected systems, and this is worth sitting with. They're extraordinarily efficient. They generate wealth and sophistication that simpler systems never could. But efficiency and resilience aren't the same thing. Every connection is also a pathway for failure. The more optimized a system becomes, the less room it has to absorb shocks. And when shocks come from multiple directions simultaneously, as they did in 1200 BC, optimized systems don't bend, they break. Egypt survived because the Nile gave it internal self-sufficiency that didn't require distant supply chains. The Phoenicians rebuilt because they were adaptable, decentralized, and hard to knock over in one blow. The civilizations that failed, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, Ugarit, were the most sophisticated, the most centralized, the most finely tuned. Their sophistication was part of what killed them. And the Sea Peoples remind us what happens to ordinary people caught in the middle of collapse. Most of them didn't choose any of this. They were probably victims of it first. People whose world had already ended, moving through the ruins, doing what displaced people have always done. Some made it. Some founded civilizations we still know today. The Philistines are in the Bible. The Phoenicians gave us the alphabet. The ancestors of the classical Greeks may have been wandering the eastern Mediterranean in those dark decades, looking for somewhere to put down roots. The Bronze Age world didn't just end, it transformed. Iron democratized technology in ways bronze never could. The rigid palace economies gave way to something more distributed and more resilient. The city-states of classical Greece, the monarchies of Israel and Judah, the trading empire of Carthage, all of it grew from the soil of the Bronze Age collapse. The lesson isn't that collapse is inevitable, it's that what gets built after collapse and who survives to build it depends on how adaptable, how decentralized, how self-sufficient your civilization was when the blow landed. That's not just a historical observation, that's a design question, and every civilization that's ever existed, including ours, is answering it right now, whether it knows it or not. So, who were the Sea Peoples? They were probably Aegean populations displaced by the very collapse they're blamed for accelerating. Refugees and raiders and opportunists and desperate families loading everything onto boats because there was nothing left to stay for. A symptom and a cause simultaneously, caught in a spiral of destruction that neither they nor their victims could fully see while it was happening. They were probably the Philistines, people whose DNA we've now sequenced, whose cities we've excavated, whose pottery still sits in museums. Possibly the ancestors of later Greeks, Lycians, Sicilians, people who built new worlds from the wreckage of the old one. But here's what we still don't know. We don't know which collapse came first. We don't know what language the Shekelesh spoke. We don't know whether the Denyen had any real connection to the Greeks. The mystery is genuine, not a branding exercise for ancient history, a substantive, unresolved question about the most consequential catastrophe the ancient world ever produced. And there's one more thing worth sitting with. The last letter from Ugarit, baked permanent by the fire that destroyed the city, was never answered. A request for help, caught in transit, preserved in clay by the very disaster it was trying to stop. Someone wrote it, someone fired the kiln, someone was waiting for a reply. 3,000 years later, we're still reading it, still trying to figure out who the ships belong to, still trying to understand how a world so sophisticated, so connected, so convinced of its own permanence could end so suddenly and leave so little behind. The search continues, and maybe the most important reason to keep searching isn't really about them. It's about making sure we recognize the warning signs before the kiln fires.